Is critical theory or critical race theory compatible with the Christian worldview and the imperative to build God's kingdom? Is there anything about critical theory that is good and could be beneficial for fulfilling the objectives of the gospel? And if so, why should we throw critical theory away completely when it could have some value that deserves to be respected and salvaged? Well, what's up, free thinklings? Welcome to another episode of Free Think or Die, hosted by Free Thinking Ministries. I'm Dr. Tim Stratton, and today we're going to be discussing something that you might have heard about recently, even though it's been around for a very long time. It's called critical theory. You've probably also heard of critical race theory, which is a subset of critical theory. So today, everything that we say about critical theory also applies to critical race theory. Just want to get that out there. Now, we've got a guest on our show today that knows a lot about this topic. But before I introduce today's guest, hey, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the Free Thinking Ministries YouTube channel. And oh yeah, make sure to ring that bell so you don't miss a single thing that we put out. Well, I met today's guest last summer, and we've become fast friends. In fact, I've invited him to write several articles recently on the Free Thinking Ministries website, freethinkingministries.com. Easy to remember. Anyway, you might not be that familiar with today's guest, but perhaps you've heard of Dr. Craig Blomberg, who is recognized as one of the leading theological thinkers in the world today. I've heard that some of his students at Denver Seminary refer to Craig Blomberg as the Atomic Blom. That's a pretty cool nickname. I don't know if he knows that they call him that, but it's pretty cool. So he needs to run with it. Anyway, let me tell you about what Dr. Blomberg, the Atomic Blom, says about today's guest. Dr. Blomberg says, I have known Phil for many years. He has participated in numerous speaking, research, and writing opportunities related to a variety of topics in philosophy and religion. I know Phil as a personal friend and as a member of my former church. We've participated in numerous activities together there, and I can say that his insights and astuteness rival those of the best of our graduate level seminary students. His reading in the areas of philosophy and religion has already surpassed the quantity that many of our graduate students do not achieve even by graduation. End quote. Well, that above letter was written in 1990. And in the 30 years since, Phil has continued to supplement his studies at the University of Iowa, studying Western philosophy, music theory, technology, and formal logic. And then at the University of Colorado, where he studied Greek classical philosophy, paleontology, ethics, and formal logic. And he also did a self-directed study in numerous cross-disciplinary fields. They include philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, Western philosophy, Eastern mysticism, philosophy of religion, and philosophy of science. He studied systematic theology, biblical studies, including textual criticism and hermeneutics. He studied the cults and the occult, scientific disciplines such as cosmology and the evolutionary theory, in contrast to the theory of abrupt appearance. Music theory, economic, socio-political issues, cultural and racial issues, and modern European social theory. I think that's almost everything that you can possibly study. I don't know. You might have missed a couple things, but it's almost everything. Anyway, I think it's
I missed lesbian dance theory.
Okay. All right. Well, that's coming up soon, I'm sure. But I think it's fair to say that our guest today has read a few more books than I have. And I thought I read a lot of books. So anyway, with that endorsement in mind, please welcome to the show, Phil Bear. How are you doing, Phil?
I'm doing great, except for my knuckle hairs.
Well, speaking of hair, who's your barber? Because he does great work.
I heard a rumor that it's the same barber you use.
Well, I don't know about that.
He teleports back and forth.
My barber is me, and I don't think I've ever cut your hair. So,
oh,
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's the same virtual barber. It's the same barber methodology
All right.
that we share. Yeah. And I just want to take this opportunity to express my condolences to you because you live in Nebraska.
Oh man, that hurts. Well, I gotta tell you, I love living in flyover country. You know, people fly over me all the time to go to your neck of the woods in Denver. You know, but
Actually, Nebraska is a great state. And do you want to know what the best thing to come out of Nebraska is?
uh, I don't know. I don't know if I want to know, but
Interstate 80.
oh, I knew I didn't want to hear it. Interstate 80. I live right on I-80, so
Yep.
it's
Yeah, and I have a former brother-in-law that used to live in Kearney, so I've spent lots of
really?
time in Kearney. Yeah, absolutely.
My
I'm
hometown.
very, very familiar with Kearney. Yeah,
Well, get back here and visit me one of these days.
I promise.
All right.
We're real friends.
Yeah, we are official. We were kind of friends, but now I'm sending you for being on this show some official Free Thinking Ministries swag. And so ever since I told you I was doing that, you said we're now official friends.
Now we're all friends instead of mostly friends.
All right. My uncle Phil is on here too, and he says Phil looks like he could be related to you. No, maybe this. I don't know if this is my uncle Phil. I do have an uncle named Phil. Anyway, we look like we're related.
So did I.
Yeah.
I'm named after him.
Yeah, that's right.
Not your uncle, but my uncle.
Right. All right. Well, should we cut to the chase and get to the topic at hand here? I'll just say this. I've had my eye on what I perceive to be some Marxist thought, kind of infiltrating our culture, the educational system, and even into American politics over the past dozen years or so. And so, yeah, I've kept my eye on it. Some red flags were being raised occasionally, literally red flags. But no, let's just say that I was concerned, at least slightly concerned, but I was not overly concerned about it. I mean, after all, I didn't really think that Marxism could take over our nation from within. But things really started to get my attention after the 2016 election. I felt like there was a shift in culture. And soon after, I stumbled across something called critical theory. And I noticed how it seemed to have roots in Marxist thought. So although I was at the time in the middle of my doctoral dissertation, which, by the way, was recently published, and it's currently #1 on Amazon. Did you know that, Phil?
I knew that.
Yeah, it's currently #1 on Amazon. It's called Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. It's published by Whippenstock. So, hey, if you're watching out there, you don't want to miss it. But that was based on my dissertation. It was expanded a little bit for the book. But although my study at the time was laser focused on theology and epistemology and metaphysics, it was really kind of indirectly related to some of the things we're going to be discussing today. In fact, there's a passing comment addressing Karl Marx in my book. But I digress. It's not about my book today. But my point was, although I was in the middle of pursuing my PhD and writing books on theology and philosophy, I had my eye on this critical theory. And I guess it's fair to say that I was studying critical theory on the side as a hobby. So I don't claim to be a critical theory scholar like you. I'm merely a scholar in theology and what I call ultimate reality, who takes a layman's interest on this important subject. And like I said, I kind of think it was a hobby, but it wasn't a fun hobby. I did not want to be studying critical theory. I was studying it because I saw it as a threat to our nation, to the world, and more importantly, a threat to the church, right, to the Christian church. So, I guess it seems that my concerns were materialized in 2020. Critical theory is the driving force, it seems, behind groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and it is unabashedly taught in universities across the nation, including the university here in my hometown at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. And sadly, it's even being promoted in many churches across the country too. Many Christians, even some Christian philosophers who should know better, are either dismissing it as not a big deal or affirming it. So anyway, with all of that said, Phil, this is why you are on the show today. Because in my opinion, you know more about this topic than the vast majority of people on the planet. This has been your focus of study for several years now. So please tell us how you were introduced to the topic and why you have chosen to laser focus on Marxism and critical theory.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Tim. I think what sparked all of this for me was that I was kind of going through YouTube, and I was studying a lot of the free videos out there from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and they have lots of material out there in a lot of different topics. And I was studying some of the economic issues, and as I was going through those videos, I saw a video on cultural Marxism, and I thought, what in the world is cultural Marxism? Because I studied Marxism long ago. Anybody who studied philosophy at the university level, Marxism is one of the fundamental things that you study often. And so I was curious, and I wanted to know what cultural Marxism was. So this was probably 5 years ago. And I've spent the last 5 years studying this in depth. And that video pretty much provided a history of cultural Marxism and how it differs from classical Marxism. And I was very intrigued when I heard this, because it was saying some things that I was beginning to hear coming from my Christian friends.
Yeah.
And it began to talk about things like white privilege and white guilt. And there was a strong racial element in there where white people are racist, and I thought, this is, I think, probably a little bit more embedded in our culture than I probably realize. And so I began to study it, and I studied it in depth, and I have been voraciously studying it. But I gave as an analogy not too long ago, I didn't want to be somebody who was like a tourist taking pictures of a mountain and trying to understand the mountain just from the pictures from the tourists. That I wanted to climb the mountain. Mm-hmm. And I think if you climb a mountain, you're going to understand that mountain far better than somebody who is 10 miles away from it just taking a snapshot of it.
Right.
But on the other hand, when you climb a mountain, and if you consider Marxism a mountain, you're never going to reach the summit. And so I feel like I understand Marxism better than I did before. And I think I understand it better than someone would if they were to just simply read about it from somebody else.
Right.
But I feel like I could spend a lifetime studying this and never exhaust the topic completely. Mm-hmm. But that's how I got started in it. And it's been kind of a passion of mine because I think that it is one of the greatest threats facing our culture right now.
Well, I agree. I think you and I first met after I wrote my first article discussing critical theory. And you got on and I think encouraged me to make a small edit and explain that to me. And we'll probably discuss some of that later. But I've learned a lot from you, and you've encouraged me to look at a few different sources. And you've written some fantastic articles on freethinkingministries.com. So really encourage people to go look at, I don't know, how many articles have you published now on our website?
I think about 5 or 6.
Yeah. Great stuff. You've published a couple reviews of some books that would include White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist. Was there another one?
Yep.
What was the other one?
Critical Theory and Introduction by Richard Delgado.
That's right. And then you've got a fantastic article, probably one of my favorites, called Marx Attacks. And it's got the best featured image of any article that we've ever had on the website. So people need to go look up Marx Attacks And yeah, Phil wrote that. So thanks
Based on
for
that movie Mars Attacks, you know.
that's
So
right. That's right.
we got Karl Marx in a space helmet, you know.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. A humorous image for a serious topic. I
Right.
like that's how I like to roll like that. I like to take our work seriously without taking ourselves too seriously. It's always a goal of mine. Sometimes I probably fail, but I think it's a good goal to shoot for. Um, so a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine who is both a PhD philosopher and an evangelical Christian posted on Facebook something to the effect that there were, I think he said there were both pros and cons with critical race theory. And he also mentioned that the church today had far greater things to worry about than critical theory or critical race theory. Now, I responded by saying that I believed that critical theory and critical race theory, that this is the greatest threat to the church right now at this point in history. And you can imagine this led to a vigorous debate amongst several theologians and philosophers and other scholars. So let's just say it kept me busy for a couple of days. That's pretty much all I focused on for a couple of days, having this conversation with these academic Christians. And at least I think most of them would identify as Christians, if not at least theists of some sort. But I know the guy that posted it is an evangelical Christian, and well known. But as that conversation was wrapping up, one of the guys in the conversation that seemed to be a neutral party, seemed kind of fair, he encouraged me to provide some content, making it clear why Christ followers and evangelical, Orthodox, and Bible-based Christians should have nothing to do with critical theory. You know, he wanted to say, okay, what is essential to critical theory? What is essential to the gospel of Jesus Christ? And how are they mutually exclusive? How are they incompatible? And so when he offered that challenge, I thought, hey, that's a good challenge. And I was on my way to Utah at the time, doing some work with Mormons in Salt Lake City with the group Maven. So didn't really have time to do anything right away, but I said, I'll get back to you. But I knew that the best way to do this was going to be an interview with you. So I invited you to do a YouTube show here. And so with that in mind, let's start unpacking this, Phil. Here's the first big question for you. What is the origin of critical theory?
Okay. Well, to answer that question, we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson. And I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible, but I want it also to be as comprehensive as possible.
Yeah.
And I also want to be humble and say that that I still have more to learn about Marxism, neo-Marxism, and critical theory, but that I've come a long way in the last several years. And so I think that what I'm going to share with you is valid and is accurate, even though there's going to be more that I'm going to be learning along the way. But as far as the origin of critical theory is concerned, we have to understand the history behind the development of Marxism from the late 19th century through the early 20th century and then up to the present day. And the first thing that we have to understand about that is to understand the nature of classical Marxism. And if you want to understand classical Marxism in a nutshell, you need to understand two concepts. One is exploitation, the other one is class struggle. So Marx believed that there were two classes in society in terms of economic categories, that there was the working class and the wealthy class. The wealthy class he called the industrial bourgeoisie, the working class he called the proletariat. This is probably review for a lot of people who study philosophy and study Marxism, but the wealthy class always oppresses the working class, and the working class is always being oppressed, and there is a resentment that is constantly building in the working class, to the point where eventually the working class will rise up and revolt against the wealthy class and they will overthrow the wealthy class, and they will assume the ownership of the means of production, and they will actually create a new society where everybody is equal and where all wealth is shared and there's no longer any class struggle. Okay, that is known as the Communist Revolution.
Okay.
And so, but there was a problem in this. There was trouble in paradise, because the Communist Revolution never took place in Europe the way that Karl Marx predicted that it would. And there were two reasons for that. One of them was that the capitalism was doing too well. That prosperity was actually growing, whereas Karl Marx thought the prosperity was going to decrease. And the people were going to get poorer and poorer, and they were going to be more destitute and more destitute and more desperate and so on. And that desperation was going to lead to this revolution. Well, it didn't happen that way. And the second reason was that the Marxists in Europe were convinced that when World War I broke out, they thought, this is it. This is going to galvanize the communist revolution in Europe. But World War I did not do that. So there was an enormous crisis in Marxism, and the Marxists in Germany, most of which were Jewish, by the way, in the post-war period, or their interwar period between World War I and World War II, around the early 1920s, they established an institute called the Institute for Social Research. And the purpose of this institute was to try to explain the causes of the crisis in Marxism. Try to understand, why is it that the Marxist communist revolution never took place, and why World War I didn't trigger it. And this was established by people like Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, George Lukács. I call him George. It's Georg probably is the best way to pronounce it, but I just call him George. Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, the psychologist. And many of these guys were inspired by an Italian political scientist by the name of Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci wrote most of his works from prison. He was in prison for about 7 years by Mussolini, even though he was actually one of the architects of the fascist regime. So he was one of Mussolini's kind of right-hand men in a way. But they had a falling out, and Mussolini began to see him as a dissident and an enemy, so he threw him in prison. So Gramsci wrote most of his works from prison, and he wrote a lot about what he called hegemony. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be talking about hegemony a little bit later on. But the intellectuals in the Frankfurt School and the Institute for Social Research eventually became known as the Frankfurt School, because they set up shop in Frankfurt, Germany, where the campus of the Goethe University was. And they began to realize that the reason why the communist revolution did not occur was because the class struggle that Karl Marx spoke of actually existed more prominently in the culture than it did in the economic spheres of life. So the oppression, the class oppression that Marx said existed in the economic categories, existed in the family, existed in the church, in religion, existed in education, existed in the arts, literature, cinema. The general culture was really where this class struggle was occurring. Wow. And the classes that were at war in the general culture were the cultural classes like white people, Christians, as opposed to minorities, people who were outcasts in society possibly, and that these cultural classes that had control of the power structures of culture were oppressing the minority classes that did not have the power structure, that did not know how to operate the levers of power in society. And you can see this very clearly in one of Max Horkheimer's books called Critical Theory, Selected Essays. And he has a chapter on the family and a chapter on religion. And he speaks about how religion is oppressive by its very nature, and how the family is oppressive. The father in the family oppresses his wife, he oppresses his children, and there's an authoritarian structure in the family that is extremely unhealthy, extremely damaging to the members of that family. So all of these cultural institutions, you might say, are full of oppression, and they are actually defined by oppression. Oppression is their very nature. And so the intellectuals in the Frankfurt School thought, okay, we're not going to be able to actually marshal this frontal assault against capitalist society and against what they called bourgeois society. If you ever hear the word bourgeois society, that's what the German Marxists thought of as the entire society that we live in, or that they lived in Europe, and that it was that oppressive society. And they thought, we can't just destroy capitalism with the frontal assault, because it's too strong. You know, people are too complacent with their material avarice, and they just don't have any incentive to try to change anything in their society, even though they're being oppressed. They don't really have the will to do anything about it. Yeah. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go inside of these institutions in society, and we're going to have to begin to break them down from within inside those institutions. And we're going to have to attack. We're going to have to find out a strategy for attack in order to dissolve Western institutions. And one of the first questions that you come up with in terms of the fact that you want to have this agenda for attack is, what weapon are we going to use to attack these institutions? How are we going to go about bringing down Western civilization? And the answer they came up with is, we're going to use the method and the weapon called, and we're going to call it, critical theory.
So I would just say, you can't use a military weapon. Our military is too strong, right? So you can't use a militarized weapon. You have to use some other kind of a weapon.
Yet you have to use a weapon that actually appeals to people's resentments. So in the classical Marxist class struggle, you have people who are let me turn this off. You have people who are resentful of how oppressed they're being, and you have to generate the same kind of resentment among the cultural classes. And so they decided that they would marshal this tool called critical theory in order to generate that kind of resentment, and that resentment would in turn turn around and begin to destabilize Western culture and Western civilizations. And so this occurred in Europe, but when World War II began to loom on the horizon, and the Third Reich came out and started to persecute Jews in Germany, most of these intellectuals in the Frankfurt School were Jewish. So they were Jewish Marxists, and they were atheists, and they decided that they were going to have to flee Germany. So most of them fled, and they went to various parts of the world, but most of them went to the United States. And they set up shop in Columbia University. And in I guess probably in the early 1940s, probably, they set up shop at Columbia University, and it was there that they began to really do the most of their retooling and most of their manufacturing work on critical theory. And the Marxist ideology itself spread from Columbia University throughout the entire United States, through the halls of academia. Wow. And to the point where now, and Gramsci called this the long march through the institutions. To the point where now you have predominantly left-wing ideologues who have the professorships and who are the faculty of most of the colleges and universities, and they are cranking out Marxists like a factory, and so that's how critical theory kind of that's how it was born. That's how they gave birth to critical theory.
Yeah, I found it interesting how you noted that the critical theorist would see just the nuclear family of Western society as oppressive, and really that model of the family can be seen. Jesus, I think, affirms that this is God's model and intent of how a family should operate, and so right away you see a conflict between Christianity and critical theory. Right. But our friend Jonathan Noyes from Stand to Reason Ministries. By the way, I get a big shout out to Greg Kokel and Stand to Reason. I'm going to be discussing some of these topics on one of their shows tomorrow with Jonathan. But John asks, hey, I'd like to know what the end game is. Where do you see this tide going, and what does our ultimate response look like? Hey, thanks for that question. I'll make sure to get to that.
We'll get there.
Yeah. So, anything else you want to say about the origin there before we move to the next question?
I think that pretty much does it. I tried to be brief on that, but there's a lot of history there.
Tried but failed. So
yeah,
it was a good answer.
I'm so sorry.
All right. So okay, let's. We got the origin out of the way. What's the nature of critical theory?
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, so let me start this by just making the comment, the general comment that that most people, when they talk about critical theory, they speak of it as though it is a worldview, or as though it is a methodology. I'm sorry, as though it is an ideology. It's a set of beliefs, and since it's a worldview in the minds of many people, we should be able to critique it as though it's a worldview, and we should apply rational analysis to it to see whether or not it's valid. I don't think that critical theory is a worldview. I don't call it a methodology, I'm sorry, I don't call it an ideology. I keep mixing up my terms here.
So I call it a methodology.
I call it
ideology, not a worldview. And this is, I was confused on that early on. I mean, I've been studying this now a little bit, like I said, as a hobby for several years, for 3 or 4 years maybe. But I was calling it a worldview up until, well, basically till I met you, and you told me I had to stop doing that. So yeah, unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, so I think that critical theory is a methodology. And it's a methodology that transmits a series of messages that are critical of Western society and culture. And we're going to talk about the purpose of those messages, but I want to talk about why it's a methodology and why the intellectuals at the Frankfurt School thought of it as a methodology. First of all, I want to give you a couple of quotes. One of the first issues that the Frankfurt School scholars had to confront was what you would call the theory-practice problem. And the theory-practice problem goes something like this. You can have all sorts of theory that describes reality, and you can understand reality by articulating that theory and helping people understand what the nature of reality is. But as soon as you do that, and by the time you're done doing that, reality is still reality. Reality hasn't changed. You just simply understood reality in an abstract sense, but the metaphysical nature of reality has not changed, no matter how much you talk about it, no matter how much you describe it and understand it. And the Frankfurt School scholars began to see that this was probably one of the main reasons why classical Marxism failed, was because people saw it as though it was an ideology, and they began to understand the theory of Marxism, but that theory didn't change the social culture and the social conditions. And the Frankfurt School scholars said, if we don't have an ideology that actually translates into change, then our ideology is worthless. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of quotes to kind of illustrate this and to kind of make this a little more concrete, and I'll try to get through these quotes as fast as I can, but in Critical Theory, Selected Essays by Max Horkheimer, on page 214 and 215, he says this: if critical theory consisted essentially in formulations of the feelings and classes or ideas of one class at any given moment, it would not be structurally different from the special branches of science. It would be engaged in describing the psychological content typical of certain social groups. It would be social psychology, nothing more. If, however, the theoretician and his specific object are seen as forming a dynamic unity with the oppressed class, so that his presentation of societal contradictions is not merely an expression of the concrete historical situation, but also a force within it to stimulate change, then his real function emerges. So he's talking about how to craft critical theory and what its purpose and what its end game should be. George Lukács wrote a book called History and Class Consciousness. He published this in 1923. He says this: even more to the point is the need to discover those features and definitions, both of the theory and the ways of gripping the masses, which convert the theory, the dialectic method, into a vehicle of revolution. Only when the fact that a class understands itself means that it understands society as a whole, and when, in consequence, the class becomes both the subject and the object of knowledge, in short, only when these conditions are all satisfied, will the unity of theory and practice, the precondition of the revolutionary function of the theory, become possible. In all metaphysics, the object remains untouched and unaltered. Now, this is extremely important. In all metaphysics, the object remains untouched and unaltered, so that thought remains contemplative and fails to become practical. While for the dialectic method, the central problem is to change reality.
Is he saying that our thoughts can change the way things are?
He's saying that there has to be a unity between our thought and our practice, and that our theory has to translate into practice, and that as we go about crafting our theory, it has to be a verb and not just something that we understand in an abstract sense. It has to be something that changes reality, that goes out and actually makes some type of social change or adjustment. And there's actually, it's really more fundamental than that. But Dr. Claudio Corradetti, who has a PhD in political theory at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, he wrote an article called The Frankfurt School and Critical Theory in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And this is where a lot of the things that I had started to suspect were true of critical theory were confirmed. Because pretty soon I discovered that I wasn't the only one who was saying these things. In this article, he says this. He says, even if characterized by several internal differences, what critical theory added to this debate was the consideration both of the anthropological as well as the psychological dynamics motivating masses. So critical theory is something that is going to appeal to a psychological response and is going to bring about change the more people understand what it really is. And when I say that critical theory is a series of messages, why is it messages rather than doctrine? And the answer to that can be found in George Lukács, again, in his book called, it was Critical Theory, and History and Class Consciousness. That book has a chapter entitled, What is Orthodox Marxism? Mm-hmm. And Lukács has this to say: Orthodox Marxism, therefore, does not imply the uncritical acceptance of the results of Marx's investigations. It is not the belief in this or that thesis, nor the exegesis of a sacred book. On the contrary, orthodoxy refers exclusively to method. And that's why I call critical theory a methodology, because what Lukács is really saying is that the reason that the communist revolution never occurred is because people didn't understand Marxist theory. They understood it as an abstract set of concepts. They didn't understand it as a vehicle or as a weapon or as an agent for social change. And so since that's the case, it stayed in this area, in the domain of the abstract, and never actually came out and expressed itself in terms of practical consequences.
Okay. Well, we've got a question here from Finding Truth asking, when can we start asking questions? and, and then somebody else says, is that a question? People are asking questions already, but yeah, you can start asking questions now. And as we go through, we might take some of these questions. And definitely if we have time at the end, we'll go back and look for some of these questions, but definitely ask your questions. And if we do run out of time, one thing I want to make clear is Phil is not going to be a one-time guest. We'll bring him back. So we will always look through some of these questions too and see if we've got more to do another show on. So Phil, is there anything else you'd like to say about the nature of critical theory?
Just that a very shining and obvious example of critical theory is Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. Yeah. Because in Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky lays out kind of a model, and he does this more in his articles and his speaking and so on. But there's hints of it in Rules for Radicals. He wanted to lay out a model for a radical who could go into his community and begin to meet with people, members of the community, and to generate resentment in the community by telling them that they are being oppressed, that they are victims, and that if they have this this resentment against being oppressed, that they will actually begin to start to do something about it. Wow. And that role of the person who would do that radical was called a community organizer.
Oh, that rings a bell.
That rings a bell, doesn't it?
If you're old enough to remember,
who's the most famous community organizer in our country?
That would be President Barack Obama.
Barack Obama,
well known as a community organizer before he got into politics.
That's right. And being a community organizer was being into politics.
Right. Yeah, right.
And
held an official elected position, I should say.
Yeah, right, sure. And when people heard that, oh, he's a community organizer. Oh,
that sounds so great.
Isn't that nice? He
love people that organize communities.
That's right. He cared about the community, and he was so compassionate. He wanted to help people, so he wanted to help the community organize so that they could be a better community. You know, that's not what community organizing is. So Barack Obama was a radical. He is a Marxist through and through, because Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, if not overtly, is covertly built on critical theory. It is built on the methods of critical theory, because the book is not called The Ideas of the Radicals. The book is called The Rules for the Radicals. This is how you become a radical. This is your methodology.
Wow. Okay.
So that goes back to the idea that critical theory is a methodology. And if we miss that, then we're gonna have a train wreck in our response to critical theory.
I'll just say this to our Christian brothers and sisters watching this, wondering if critical theory and even Rules for Radicals are or could be compatible with Christianity. Saul Alinsky dedicated his book to Satan himself, the first radical, I believe he says. Yeah. So I think that he was probably an atheist, but like the idea of Satan. But I don't know, maybe he was a Satanist. I don't know for sure.
Well, we were talking about that a little bit before the show. You know, is that it's kind of a weird relationship between Satanism and atheism, and right. You would think a Satanist would be a theist because, you know, if there's a Satan, then there should be a God, you know, and so on. But you can be a Satanist and an atheist at the same time, apparently. So,
well, yeah, I do know at least one guy who I helped get out of Satanism, and he is now a Christian. But he would have told you that during his time in Satanism, he was an atheist.
mhm.
So, but I also know of Satanists that actually believe in Satan and want, try to worship him. So, it depends on the Satanist you're talking to.
All right.
All right. Well, let's move to the next. We've got the origin and the nature of critical theory in mind. Now let's talk about the purpose. What is the purpose of critical theory?
Yeah. I would argue that the purpose of critical theory is to deconstruct, disrupt, dismantle, destabilize, and destroy Western society from within its own institutions. And when I talk about critical theory, I talk about it being a weapon, and I've been talking about it. I've been calling it a weapon for a long time.
Yeah.
But recently, after I was calling it a weapon for quite a while, I read a book by Douglas Kellner, and this was written in 1984. And the title of the book is Herbert Marcuse and the Crisis of Marxism. And that title, obviously, just all the bells and the sirens started going off when I saw that title, because I thought this is my passion, or at least one of them. On page 116 of that book, it says Marcuse's position is that philosophy can play a progressive role in social theory by developing concepts that are subversive to the prevailing ideologies and can provide weapons of critique in the struggle for a better society. And when I read that, I thought that's a lot of confirmation. Here's a scholar that's been studying this stuff, and he's been studying Herbert Marcuse in general and specifically. And so I would say that he is probably one of the best experts on who Herbert Marcuse was. And Herbert Marcuse is one of the primary sources of the spread of Marxism in our country. So if you want to understand critical theory and you want to understand Marxism in general, neo-Marxism, coming from the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse is the guy to study. And I think he was one of the first ones to transplant to Columbia University, and he was extremely influential in American academia. So,
Really?
I think it is very apropos, very appropriate to call critical theory a weapon, and I call it a weapon of destruction, because it is a weapon. It is not a bunch of suggestions to improve. The communist revolution was not a series of suggestions that are dropped in the suggestion box of the industrial bourgeoisie. It was a takeover. It was a revolution. And the only way that you can accomplish a revolution is to bring down the enemy and then erect your own framework in its place. So the neo-Marxist agenda is the same way. You can't ask nicely to rip out a society by its roots and replace it with a new order. It just doesn't work that way. I was going to comment about the comments by a guy named Moses Apostaticus, who is also he is also a scholar who has studied cultural Marxism to a pretty extensive degree. He says this in his book, Civilizationism, Why the West is Collapsing and How We Can Save It, 2017. He says, thus we see the neo-Marxist left, who has been programmed by the globalist establishment to destroy their own civilization, aligning with the Islamic agenda. They don't really care about the rights of women, immigrants, gays, or the transgender movement. These groups are used as vehicles by cultural Marxists to carry out their real goal, the destruction of Western civilization.
And doesn't the Marxist refer to people that it doesn't really care about, but that will join their movement? Isn't the term for them useful idiots?
Useful idiots.
That's from the Marxists themselves, right? Wow.
Pretty much, yeah.
And so that would probably be the way that these Marxists are looking at the people who are rioting in the streets today. they would call them useful idiots. We wouldn't, right? But that's what they are. The people that are on the front lines with their own, making sure the rules for the radicals are being employed. They call the useful idiots.
Well, I would call them useful idiots for that agenda.
Right. Yeah.
I wouldn't want to use them as useful idiots for our agenda, obviously.
Right.
Because my longing is to educate people.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that once someone has already been brainwashed by the Marxist ideology and is starting to carry the weapon of critical theory, there's usually not much you can do about that person. You're probably not going to be able to recruit that person out of that agenda.
You can't reason with them.
No, they cannot be reasoned with, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later, and we're going to talk about it soon. But no, you cannot reason with them. And so I come up with the analogy of the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
When you go out there on the battlefield, you don't go out to the trenches and you don't start engaging in some type of a coherent argument with the other side. They've got guns. Okay, you can't fight an army with an argument when that army has got guns and they're shooting at you. Okay, and so you're not going to be able to reason with the foot soldiers of Marxism, because, as I said before, critical theory is designed to bypass the rational mind and to appeal to a psychological response, to appeal to people's primal fear and primal rage. If you tell them that they are oppressed and that it's the white man and it's the capitalist that is oppressing them, they're going to experience an emotional response to that nothing rational can address. You cannot address that kind of rage and that kind of visceral psychological response. You can't address it with reason, because they're not operating on the level of reason at all. So the only thing that we can do is appeal to people that have not been recruited into that army yet. Okay.
Right.
Now, so we do argue, and we do provide solid, coherent arguments that can take down the Marxist ideology, and we do so, by the way, also by taking down atheism, which is the core, the bedrock of Marxist ideology, and that's where your contributions are so important. Because arguing for the Christian worldview is valuable if you can get to them before they've been recruited into the army.
Right. Amen.
Once they've been recruited into the army, you cannot reason with them anymore. It's impossible. Okay. Now, I believe that God can effect miracles, but I'm not going to necessarily go out and count on it. But this conjures up the skit. Have you ever heard of Monty Python's Flying Circus?
I'm definitely familiar with Monty Python, but remind me of the Flying Circus.
Well, the Monty Python's Flying Circus was the syndicated television show from the BBC for, in the 60s and 70s, and it was syndicated throughout the 80s and 90s, and it just a whole cult came up.
I've just the search for the Holy Grail. So.
Yeah. Monty Python, same group of comedians, same troupe, and they had a skit one time on one of their shows where a man was sitting up in his flat in London, and he wrote down the joke that was so funny that anyone who heard it would die laughing. And so he wrote the joke and he said it out loud, and he started laughing, and then he fell over dead. And his mother comes in and she says, "Oh, what's happened to you?" So she picks up the joke and she reads it and she laughs and she falls over dead. So pretty soon it finds its way into the Royal Army, and now you've got soldiers in World War II who are running through the battlefield, telling this joke very loudly with pieces of paper in front of them, and the Germans are all laughing and they all fall dead, and they don't have to fire a shot, and they actually win the war because they told this joke that's so funny that people will die laughing, And I thought that's kind of the way that's kind of the way it is. We can't just go out on the battlefield and just read a bunch of lines and just and put forth a bunch of arguments and expect to win the war by just sitting there arguing with the enemy, arguing with them out of their violent agenda. So that's the little entertainment side, sideshow.
Yeah. We've got a comment here that says, if you think you're the hero in the biblical narrative, you're reading it wrong. And I don't think either of us think that we're the hero. We totally agree that Jesus is the hero. But we also see that there's commands given to us in the law of Christ and biblical commands in general. And we're concerned about that. I mean, we are called to, Paul says, to destroy every argument raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive. And so we're supposed to destroy bad arguments raised against the knowledge of God, which is what Marxism is built upon. And Marxism employs that tool of critical theory. So this is very relevant. Paul also tells us there in that same verse to take our thoughts captive. And we compare and contrast that with Colossians 2:8, where he warns us that bad philosophy can take us captive. And that's exactly what Marxism and critical theory is. It's really bad thinking. It's based upon really bad thinking. So, and finally, in the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah 1:18, I believe, he says that there's a command from God here. Come, let us reason together, saith the Lord. So we are all about reasoning and showing people that, let's study apologetics. This is one way that we can know ultimate reality. And when we know ultimate reality as an apologist, a metaphysician, a systematic theologian, if we study all these things and we can know ultimate reality, then we can compare and contrast different ideas to see if they're compatible with ultimate reality or not. And so we're thinking biblically, we're thinking philosophically and metaphysically, and just using apologetics to know ultimate reality and to help other people know ultimate reality, so that they can see that this critical theory is really shallow philosophy that is infecting minds. And if we love our neighbors, we're going to be fighting against this. And
the other thing that we have to understand is that we have to get to people before they become converted into the zombies. And I don't want to diminish the power of God in any way, shape, or form, because I believe that God can reach in and he can transform the minds of people who are out there using critical theory as a weapon against Western society. I believe he can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is the epitome of wisdom for us to get them while they're young and to nip this in the bud and to educate and expose what we're seeing so that people can understand it. So the comment said, if you think you are the what?
The hero in the
hero
narrative. Yeah.
So let's take that comment and let's unpack it a little bit. And I'm going to kind of modify a little bit. Instead of calling us or calling me or calling ourselves the heroes, I think that what we are is the intel officers in the war. Because the intel officer, whenever you have intel in a war, what your intel tells you is what weapons are the enemies using and where is the enemy attacking. Those are some of the two of the questions that the intel personnel answer.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, we are the intel officers in the war against Marxism, because we are exposing the weapon, what the nature of the weapon is, and we are exposing where the enemy is attacking. And if you do that, then you have a good chance of being able to confront the enemy and be able to win that war. And we're putting on the armor of God, and in this case, the application of the armor of God is to educate people as to what the enemy is all about before they actually get recruited by the enemy, and then to identify where the enemy is attacking and what the nature of the enemy's weapons are. I think that's extremely biblical.
And definitely we didn't, and that doesn't, just because we're warriors or intel soldiers or whatever. That doesn't mean we're hero. We are the hero. Jesus is the hero.
We're servants.
But we are called to be warriors. I mean, and here, I mean, Hebrews has the heroes of the faith. All right, so there are definitely we like you said, we're called to wear that armor. In Ephesians 6, we are called to fight, and we are called to expose lies and to show truth. So, and Jonathan Noyes comments again. He says, maybe this is why we apologetics guys get stuck. We want to bring an argument or two to the fight, but arguments don't work with the folks who don't care about truth. And he's exactly right. I wrote an article not long ago on freethinkingministries.com called the Woking Dead and the Futility of Reason. Really like the show The Walking Dead. It's all about zombies. And I was comparing these woke folks in the streets to zombies. Instead of The Walking Dead, I called them the Woking Dead, because there's just no reason. It's like it's trying to reason with a zombie. You can't do it. And if you got one or two of them in front of you, it's not that big a deal. But as soon as there's a mob in the street, you better run, because it's dangerous at that point.
You're not going to stand there and reason with them. It's just not. Yeah.
So the goal is, as you said, Phil, is to reason with those who are in danger of being infected with this virus, and inoculate them before it's too late.
Right.
So get the truth out there to the masses before it's too late. And and Jonathan is a huge apologetics guy. Stand to Reason is all about apologetics. And in fact, I would say Greg Koukl's Tactics is mandatory reading for anybody out there today wanting to know how to interact with people who are infected or at least in danger of becoming infected with critical theory or critical race theory. But with that said, is there anything else you'd like to say about the purpose of critical theory?
Oh.
All right. Well, Jonathan asked earlier, what's the end game of critical theory? So how would you answer, Jonathan?
I would say the end game is a revolution that is similar to the communist revolution, except that the minority cultural classes are going to overthrow the classes that supposedly have hegemony and that control the levers of power in society. So instead of the working class rising up and overthrowing the wealthy class, you have the minority classes and the oppressed classes in society that are overthrowing the oppressors, because the classes that have the oppression, the classes that have the hegemony, the power, are oppressive, and they have to be overthrown. And by the way, it's interesting because this overthrow process is also has nothing to do with reason, because the Marxist who is using critical theory to try to bring about this social transformation doesn't think that the capitalists or that the oppressive classes can be reasoned with. So there's kind of an irony here,
Don't they reject reason, though?
Pardon me?
It seems to me that you can't reason with them because they reject reason. As soon as you start appealing to reason or math or even science, they'll say, "Oh, well, you're just imposing your will to dominate, to keep your position of power, to influence cultural norms or whatever."
Classical reason is actually considered oppressive. That's part of our oppressive strategy. They believe that reason is oppressive. But there's two things
that's opposed to the biblical mandate of "Come, let us reason together." And every philosopher should be opposed to this. Right?
Here's the interesting thing about that, and here's the clever part about this, that for the Marxist, they have redefined the word reason.
I give up.
Reason, in the classical sense, is following the laws of logic and going through a linear process of analytic development where we arrive at truth. And that is the classical methodology of reasoning. But for the Marxist, reason means something different. Reason is purpose-driven activism for the Marxist.
Yeah.
Because I said before that if your ideology does not translate into social action, then it is considered irrational
Okay.
by the Marxist.
Hmm.
So if we don't understand the fact that these terms have been redefined, then we are not going to be able to confront this issue. And if we understand it, we will be able to confront the issue. But there's another aspect of reasoning that we're going to touch on in kind of the next section of what we're going to deal with here. So I'll save that for the remainder of this discussion. So.
All right. Well, really quickly, we got Finding Truth here asks, so how does the academy, philosophy specifically, deal with a movement that appeals mostly to emotion rather than reason? So how would you answer that?
Well, I was kind of planning on addressing our response.
Okay, well, let's table that then.
It's kind of near the end. So let's promise that we'll get back to that question.
That sounds good.
But I think there's another issue that we need to deal with first.
Okay, that works for me. So, why is critical theory not compatible with the aims of Christian mission and discipleship? I see so many churches right now that seem to have been infected with critical theory or critical race theory. And like I said, I've even seen some Christian academics who are starting to promote it. And in fact, I know full well that my former alma mater at Biola University, not the philosophy department or the apologetics department, but other departments at this otherwise awesome Christian university have been infected by critical theory and critical race theory. And in fact, some of the chapel speakers have been just horrible recently. So I'm calling on you, Biola, step up your game and make sure to get critical theory out, get it off the campus. Otherwise, I'm going to have to start supporting other apologetics places because, well, I'll tell you this, I have been told firsthand by professors in the apologetics department at Biola University that they are fighting it and that critical race theory has not infiltrated the master's degree program in apologetics. So good job, MACA program at Biola. Stay strong there. But Biola University as a whole, get your act together. But anyway, my point is a lot of Christians are confused now, Phil. Why is critical theory not compatible with the aims of Christian mission and discipleship?
Well, I think an illustration is in order. I think an analogy is in order.
Okay, all right. You sent me a video clip.
Yeah, let's play a video clip.
Let me see if I can do this here. Share screen. I've never done this before. Application. I think this will work. And
strangers from distant lands, friends. Aragorn is right. You cannot. You have only one choice. The ring must be destroyed.
all right, give it up for the Lord of the Rings. So, I mean, if I'm tracking with I think you're giving an analogy here. There might be some good things about the ring. After all, it's the ring of power and it's really cool. It can make you invisible. You could do some good things with it, but should we have anything to do with it?
And look how beautiful it is.
It is beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. So unpack this for us.
Well, I would call critical theory the critical theory ring of power. Critical theory answers to its master alone. It only has one master. It has no other master. The master is Marxism and ultimately Karl Marx. Karl Marx is Sauron, and critical theory is his servant. And so there are several reasons why Marxism is the only master for critical theory, and critical theory is incompatible with Christian discipleship, with the gospel, with biblical principles. And so the first thing that I would say, and this is going to address the issue of reason. The first thing that we need to understand is that critical theory is based on and built using Hegel's dialectic method of thought, which is incompatible with the laws of logic. Now, some of the people who are listening here might be familiar with George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and he was the philosopher who influenced Karl Marx in a profound way in terms of his understanding of how we arrive at knowledge and how we reason, and how we come up with truth claims and how we arrive at knowledge. I'm not going to go into Hegel's dialectic method because it is extremely difficult to describe, but a very high-level approach to it is that instead of looking at a logical proposition and then understanding that that proposition is a thesis and that it has an antithesis, in other words, it has a denial of the truth of that proposition, that the answer to those two propositions we call a contradiction, that is the relationship between those two propositions. And Hegel said, no, that's not right. We're going to throw that away, and we're going to come up with a new method for understanding the relationship between a proposition, a thesis, and its antithesis. Now, Hegel never called them thesis and antithesis. He never used this terminology, but philosophers have used this terminology to describe it since then. And so what Hegel basically said was, in the terminology of the modern philosophers, instead of having a thesis and antithesis and calling them a contradiction, we're going to take that thesis and antithesis and we're going to synthesize the two. And so you have a triadic movement of logical development instead of a linear one in classical logic. And so the new synthesis has now become the new proposition, and we're going to throw the other ones away. So it is a triadic movement of logical reasoning, and I would argue that it represents a rejection of the law of non-contradiction.
Wow.
So, and now there is a debate among some philosophers, because some philosophers say that Hegel didn't really reject the law of non-contradiction. But I stand with the philosophers who say, yeah, he did. And so what I would argue is that if you adopt Hegel's dialectic method, then what you are actually arriving at is irrationality.
Right.
And Karl Marx was extremely impressed with Hegel's dialectic method, and he adopted that method in the whole course of his philosophy and his economic theory. So just to kind of underline that a little bit, in History and Class Consciousness, again, the book by George Lukács, I'm gonna try to get through these quotes, but they're extremely important. He says, we adhere to Marx's doctrines then without making any attempt to diverge from them, to improve or to correct them. The goal of these arguments is an interpretation and exposition of Marx's theory as Marx understood it. And so if there's ever a question as to whether or not the intellectuals at the Frankfurt School actually were pure Marxists and that were loyal to Karl Marx, there should be no question about that, because he says we adhere to Marxist doctrines without attempt to diverge from them. We make no apology for it. We are Marxists, period. Okay? The war, the crisis, and the revolution have not thrown a single problem that cannot be solved by the dialectical method and by that method alone. And he's talking about Hegel's dialectic method. Now, just real quickly, I'm going to say this very quickly, but Hegel was an idealist and Marx was a materialist. So Marx rejected.
So by an idealist, do you mean he didn't believe that matter actually existed?
He believed that if matter does exist, that it is a product of mind. It's a product of ideas. and there are different schools of idealism. Some schools of idealism say that matter does have concrete reality, but a lot of them say matter does not have concrete reality. It only exists inside inside of a mind.
So it'd be similar to the Matrix.
Yeah.
When Neo says, "This chair isn't real,"
Right.
and Morpheus is like, "What is real, Neo?" Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So now, I just a side note, I do know some Christian idealists. I've actually got an article on that topic. I'm open to it. I don't think it's true, but I see their case, and we'll say, all right, I think their case is compatible with some form of Christian theism, but obviously this isn't that kind of idealism. So,
right.
Explain that to us.
And so Marx rejected Hegel's idealism because Marx was a materialist. So the way that Marx arranged reality was to say that the material world is the primary reality, that the material has primacy, and that ideas and anything non-physical is simply arises out of the material world. And
it would rise on kind of right on top of matter.
That's right. Ideas right on top of material reality, whereas idealism says that material reality rides on the top of ideas.
And for that is epiphenomenalism.
Yes, and the emergent property view, I think, is related to that to a certain degree. I don't want to get too much into. I don't want to get off on a bunny trail on that, but a lot of people criticize me for saying that Marx adopted Hegel's dialectic method, hook, line, and sinker, and he adopted it wholesale. And they just say, well, that's just not true, and it isn't true. Karl Marx did have a lot of disagreements with Hegel, but in terms of the dialectic method, though. Marx was Hegel's biggest fan.
Really?
Okay? Yeah. So Lukács goes on to say, to be clear about the function of theory is also to understand its own basis, i.e. the dialectical method. Now he's talking about critical theory here because all of neo-Marxist theory is about critical theory. And so critical theory, according to Lukács, is that it is intrinsically grounded in the dialectical method. We cannot do justice to the concrete historical dialectic without considering some detail of the founder of this method, Hegel, of his relation to Marx. Marx's warning not to treat Hegel as a dead dog has gone unheeded even by many good Marxists, according to Lukács. Okay. He says, I am thinking exclusively of the phrase which talks of flirting with Hegel's mode of expression. This has frequently misled people into believing that for Marx, the dialectic was no more than a superficial stylistic ornament. Yet they fail to notice that whole series of categories in central importance and in the constant use stem directly from Hegel's logic. And so this is designed to, the reason we're going through this is designed to confirm and underline the fact that critical theory is derived from Marxist ideology, and Marxist ideology is completely grounded in Hegel's dialectic methodology of reasoning, which means that it rejects the law of non-contradiction and is therefore illogical and irrational in the classical sense. So the other thing that we have to understand about that is that, oh, you know what? Before I go on, I want to actually say something about something that you brought up a couple days ago. Okay. On critical theory and empirical science, we have this to say, or Lukács has this to say, on the basis of Habermasian premises, indeed, there can be no objective knowledge, as positivists claim, detached from intersubjective forms of understanding. Since knowledge is strictly embedded in serving human interests, it follows that it cannot be considered value neutral and objectively independent. So in this framework, there's no such thing as objective knowledge. If there is no subjective knowledge, then the question you asked me the other day is, does empirical science have a place in this framework? The answer is no, because if you have no objective knowledge, you cannot do empirical science.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just that statement, it's a knowledge claim. There is no objective knowledge. Well, do you know that? If
Right.
so, it's self-defeating. Well, then they say, well, we reject logic. You're just using logic to impose your will to dominate. Oh, okay, this is why you
You're
can't.
using logic to tell me that we're using logic to,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it is an irrational view.
Right.
And it's
So,
not biblical because it is the Bible that tells us to reason together. The Bible tells us day after day, your creation pours forth speech. Night after night, it delivers knowledge. That's talking about doing good empirical science right there.
so
So-
if you are going to embrace any kind of methodology that is built upon the dialectic method coming from Hegel intrinsically, then it is automatically incompatible with the Christian faith. Because the Christian faith is built on the laws of logic, the logos of God, the reasoning of God, and that's how our minds have been designed to reason. And if you want to confirm the idea that Hegel really did reject the law of non-contradiction, you just look at how all of his disciples apply his theoretical framework. They reject the law of non-contradiction as well, because as soon as we try to argue from the law of non-contradiction, they just dismiss it and say, well, we don't play by those rules. Okay. So what you're saying is just gibberish to us. Okay.
but in reality, they're the ones uttering gibberish.
Right.
Exactly. When you reject logic, what are you left with?
So the other aspect of this, it's extremely important. And this blends together with your libertarian free will argument and with your book very strongly. Is that the dialogue? Pardon me?
Speaking my language.
I am. I'm going to speak your languages. The next thing I'm going to say is going to be right up your alley. Okay. The dialectic method, Hegel's dialectic method, is deterministic. It's impossible for it to be otherwise. All right. I talked earlier about the theory practice problem.
Right.
And for the Marxist, who is an atheist and automatically a determinist, the theory practice problem is unavoidable or is unsolvable within the deterministic framework unless you adopt the formation of the unity between theory and practice. If there's no unity between theory and practice, then in a deterministic system, your theory practice problem is not solved, and therefore critical theory is dead in the water and cannot operate. And what I've observed is that I think that the problem of theory and practice is solved beautifully in the New Testament, because Paul he organizes his letters in terms of theory and method. And another way to say that is he organizes his epistles in terms of theology and application. So if you notice that almost all of Paul's epistles have two parts. They have a part where he lays out the theological framework, and then he says, okay, now that you understand this theology, here's how to apply it. Okay? Put on righteousness, clothe yourselves, build one another up. Because of all of this theological reality, here are the ways that we can practically express this in our lives. And so the theory practice problem is solved beautifully in the New Testament, but what's happening is that the practice is being done on the basis of our own volition, out of our dedication to Christ. So we apply the theology of our own free will. We are free moral agents who apply this theology out of our own volition and out of our desire to bring our will into conformity with God's will.
Let me just share a verse off the top of my head that I've been looking into lately. Paul says this in Galatians 5:13. He says, "For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful natures. Instead, serve one another in love." So he's saying, hey, use your free will. You've been called to live in freedom. You could do this, but instead do that. So he's actually saying you have alternative options available, but do the right thing. Use your freedom to love each other instead of being selfish.
Exactly. And so without free will, we're called to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth.
Mhm.
So that means that we have to have social involvement as part of our discipleship. Without free will, social involvement is meaningless because it carries no moral weight. If we're just acting as automatons and then we're not choosing to be involved and to take the message of Christ to the world and to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, if we're not choosing to do that, then it has no moral value.
Right.
Because we're just doing it as robots.
Mhm.
A machine cannot act morally,
Right.
and a conditioned reflex cannot have moral properties.
Mhm.
So this idea of reason and determinism is fatal to critical theory and means that it has no place in Christian theology and in biblical principles and in discipleship. The second reason is that critical theory is derived from an atheistic framework that considers all religion an oppressive social pathology. What did Karl Marx say about religion?
Opiate of the masses.
Opiate of the masses. Religion is oppressive. Religion is a pathology. And so any methodology that is derived from a view or from a treatment of religion as being a pathology there's no way that you can harmonize that with the gospel and with Christian discipleship. It's just simply impossible.
Well, I was just going to say, it really comes down to the fact that is Christianity true or false? If it's false, if God does not exist, and if Jesus wasn't risen from the dead, then it is an opiate of the masses. But if God actually exists and did raise Jesus from the dead, then it's just true. And we ought to correspond to reality, right? And so the cool thing is, and that's why, again, apologists, if you're watching, this is why Free Thinking Ministries, as an apologetic-based organization, takes this so seriously, because we know that Christianity is true. We have the evidence showing that it's true, and therefore Marxism is false. It's a shallow philosophy, critical theory, that methodology, the weapon used by the Marxists, which is built upon atheism. It's false. It's a shallow philosophy. That's why we care about this. People are, I can't tell you, Phil, how many notes and messages I've received lately saying, how come you're spending so much time on politics and political issues? It's because it's related. It's all related to apologetics and worldview and good theology. It's all related.
Yeah, there was a movie that came out in something like 1995 called Unstrung Heroes. Did you ever see that movie? Brilliant movie. And the movie is about a boy whose mother is dying of cancer. And he decides that he is going to he's going to get a box, and he's going to put all sorts of little reminders of his mother's life in this box while she's still alive. And so he puts her watch in there. He puts little, he puts a lock of hair in there, and he's just watching his mother in wonder, because she is this angelic being in his life that he loves passionately and dearly, and he doesn't want to miss any part of who she is. And so he follows her around, and as she lives her life, he gathers mementos of the events in her life, and he puts it in this box. And her husband, played by John Turturro, was a very, very bitter man. And he had two brothers, and his brothers were not very intelligent. They were just kind of average intelligence. And his brothers said to him, you are suffering because of the impending death of your wife, and you're so bitter about all of this. And they suggested that, maybe you should look into, the church, and you should find solace in religious commitment in Christ, and they didn't necessarily come out and use the name of Christ himself, but he said, no, a religion is just nothing but a crutch.
Hmm.
I'm not gonna stoop to something that's just a crutch. And one of his brothers says to him, but a crutch isn't bad if you need it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That had a huge impact on me. And so maybe religion is the opiate of the masses in a certain way, but maybe there's a way in which we need that redemption. We are empty and we need to be filled with the divine life of God. And if you want to call that an opiate, then go right ahead.
Right.
I don't care.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Hey, my friend who's also been on the show before, named Adam Madavi. He's a college student, and he is currently fighting the good fight against Marxism and critical race theory on his college campus. He's from Iranian descent, married to a black woman, and he is called racist all the time because he opposes critical race theory on the college campus. He even takes some heat from his professors. But nevertheless, he is continuing to speak truth. But he asks a question. Maybe you already answered it, so forgive me if you have. But he says, can you point to specific claims in the Communist Manifesto that connects with Hegel's dialectic method, which rejects the law of non-contradiction?
There probably isn't going to be anything in the Communist Manifesto about that.
Or would you point him, what works would you point him to?
Well, I would actually point him to some of Marx's writings themselves. There's lots of letters that Karl Marx wrote to Friedrich Engels that mentioned Hegel, and where he complained that some people were saying that Marx considered Hegel a dead dog, like I referred to earlier, and that Marx would have none of that. So there are writings within the whole library of Marxist writings, you know, whether they're articles or letters or books or whatever it happens to be, that will give you that indication that he is strongly reliant on Hegel. But you're probably not going to find much in the Communist Manifesto itself, because the Communist Manifesto was really an agenda for revolution, and it didn't have a whole lot of the philosophical foundations that Marx relied on. It's pretty high level stuff, and it's pretty first order stuff instead of second order stuff. But there are more reasons why critical theory is incompatible with Christianity, and so I'd like to try to finish these. The third one is that critical theory is not designed to reform or improve society. So it is incompatible with the idea of being the salt of the earth, where things get better in our society, even though the coming kingdom is going to be the full expression, of the transformation of society. It's something that God is going to do. Christians are not called down. Christians are not called to tear down society and to destroy the social order in which they live.
Yeah, we're called to destroy bad arguments. Right.
And we're not trying to build the kingdom of God ourselves manually. We influence society, and we go into society, and we are a great fragrance in society, where we build the kingdom of God in the sense that God is with us and in us, and that we love other people, and that's an expression of the kingdom of God. But it's not going to be the apocalyptic expression of the kingdom of God. But critical theory is out to create an apocalypse, and that is incompatible with the call of the Christian. And then number 4, based on number 3, critical theory is incompatible with Christian faith, since Christianity does not call disciples to destroy the existing social order. Number 5, critical theory is derived from Marxist class consciousness. And that's something that we really need to expand on a little bit. I have talked about class before, where it is the cultural classes that are at war with each other, as opposed to simply the economic classes. But some people hear the word class and they think, what is a class? What in the world is that all about? What does it mean to be a member of a class? And a class is in cultural Marxism is something where you can group people together and say that they all have some common characteristic that makes it so that they belong to a certain class. So, for example, white people can be a class because they share white skin in common. Black people can be a class, all right? Christians can be considered a class, or in general, religious people can be considered a class as opposed to non-religious people, okay? And so there are all these classes in society, and if you belong to more than one of these oppressed classes, then that is what they call intersectionality, where you actually belong to more than one class, and all those classes are actually being oppressed. So you're being doubly oppressed or triply oppressed or whatever. In critical theory, which is a methodology built on Marxist ideology, this is what class is all about in Marxist ideology. And this comes from Herbert Marcuse, which is one of the central figures in neo-Marxist movement, as I said before. He writes this: the class is the actual social and economic unit, not the individual. It achieves an independent existence over against the individuals, so that the latter find their conditions of existence predestined, determined, and hence have their position in life and their personal development assigned to them by their class, and become subsumed under it. The personal individual becomes a class individual, and his constituent properties become universal properties that he shares with all other members of his class. His existence is not his, but that of his class. I wrote an article in response to Kelly Hamron's article in Christianity Today.
Right.
And I was critical of some of the things that she said, but she did say something that was extremely profound and extremely valid. And she said, under Marxism, there's no such thing as separate selves. I am not myself, you are not yourself. We are defined by our class. We are not defined by our individuality.
Wow.
And that's from Herbert Marcuse, and that's the book I highly recommend. It's called Reason and Revolution, Hegel and the Rise of Social Theory. It was published in 1941. This came from page 295. So class ideology is completely incompatible with Christianity, because Christianity is built on one of the foundation ideas that we are created in God's image, and that we are individuals, that our individuality matters, and that we are actually redeemed as individuals. The gospel is about personal redemption. It's not about class redemption.
And the personal relationship with Jesus Christ.
That's right. That's right. So the idea of personal individuality is completely out of place in Marxist ideology, and therefore critical theory is going to inherit all of those characteristics from Marxist ideology. And therefore, as a methodology, it cannot be compatible with the Christian faith. Number 6, critical theory makes no specific truth claims, but articulates whatever messages are useful in destroying the existing social order.
So that's where it gets really confusing. Like, what's essential to critical theory and what's essential to Christianity, and then try to compare them and show what's wrong. Well, it gets really confusing because it doesn't make any truth claims.
Yeah.
Right. So
you can't compare the two. Critical theory is not a set of propositions that are intended to be understood rationally. It is a series of messages that appeal to people's emotions and appeals to a psychological response that will motivate them, that will galvanize their activism in order to bring down Western civilization. That's what critical theory is all about. But when people when people hear some of the claims of critical theory, then they get confused, because critical theory seems to make claims.
Right.
Some claims of critical theory, some of the more vulgarized claims of critical theory that you hear now is capitalism is an oppressive economic system. Right?
Or all cops are bad.
All cops are bad, or all cops are the other B word.
Right.
that police are intrinsically racist, and they're hunting down black people systematically, and they want to kill them all off. Okay,
That's what LeBron James says, so it's got to be true.
That's right. We live in a racist society. All white people are racist just because they're white people. Then there's class ideology right there. Wow. Because you're racist because you're white. If you're white, you're racist, and there's no exception to the rule because you're defined by your class, not by your individuality. Wow. America was founded on white supremacy, right? So you hear all these messages of critical theory, and they are the vulgarized, condensed messages that critical theory is launching today in our society and in our culture. And so when people hear that, they think, oh, that's a truth claim. But it's not a truth claim. They want you to think it's a truth claim. Critical theory masquerades as legitimate academic subject matter. And it wants you to think that it has this incredible academic pedigree behind it. It does not. It is a set of messages that are not intended to be understood rationally as truth claims.
But we can use it for good.
Yeah. But people can build an ideology on those messages, mm-hmm. and that's certainly possible. But that they're suckers when they're doing that, because they don't understand that critical theory is not designed to plant seeds of ideology. Critical theory is designed to plant seeds of resentment and rage, and to motivate people to go out and actively destroy Western civilization. So that's probably one of the most important things that we've said today. And that's why I don't call it an ideology. That's why I don't call it a worldview, because it does not make truth claims. Truth in Marxist ideology, and this is actually number 7, therefore critical theory cannot contain anything that can be considered truthful and therefore potentially constructive. Critical theory is devoid of truth in the classical sense. So just like I said, that reason has been redefined as purpose-driven activism in mm-hmm. Marxism, truth is also redefined. Truth is the manifestation of revolution. So if you're truthful, that means that you have actually accomplished the kind of revolution that Karl Marx dictates to you that should occur, or that the neo-Marxists in the Frankfurt School should occur. That's what truth is for the Marxists. So for them to say, well, this is something that is true, and I'm being truthful when I say that America is a racist country, you have to understand that their idea of truth is not the same as the classical idea of truth. And so everything is just going to get mixed up, and we're going to miss the general point of critical theory. And if we miss the general point of critical theory, we're not going to be able to confront it in our society, because we're going to sit around trying to argue with them. We're going to sit around trying to use arguments to defend against critical theory. It just doesn't work that way.
So when you say the classical definition of truth, I mean, that would also be the biblical definition of truth.
Yes. If you notice, biblical truth is all an expression of the classical laws of logic. I can give you an example. There's an argument in logic called the hypothetical syllogism. And one of the forms of the hypothetical syllogism is the modus tollens. And I may be losing a few people that haven't been trained in logic, but the idea is, if it's raining, then my yard is wet. My yard is not wet, therefore it's not raining. So if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. Now, the Apostle Paul uses that hypothetical syllogism as the modus tollens in the book of Galatians. He says, if I were trying to please men, I would not be a disciple of Christ. I am a disciple of Christ, therefore I am not trying to please men.
Right.
And you find this all over the place. Christ uses the modus tollens everywhere. I was just thinking of an example of it recently, and I don't remember what the example was, but Jesus uses the same argument.
Yeah, you can find that. He doesn't go premise 1, premise 2, conclusion, but they're implied premises in his statement. Right. So.
Yeah, and so the Bible is full of deductive reasoning, linear deductive reasoning. which is completely incompatible with critical theory, because critical theory is the methodology that utilizes the dialectic method and has nothing to do with deductive reasoning. And the Bible is full of it. So the two are just, they're like oil and vinegar. They just simply don't mix. They just don't.
So Christians cannot wield this weapon.
That's right. Christians cannot wield the ring of power. It answers to Sauron alone. It has no other master. And if you modify critical theory, if you say, okay, well, tell you what, let's do. Let's take some of the attributes of critical theory and let's delete them so that what we have left over can be useful for the Christian.
Right. I think the Christian philosopher I was talking to a couple of weeks ago, I think that's what he was saying. There's pros and cons. So, get rid of some of the things that might not be that helpful, but let's take the good things.
Yeah.
So what do you say to that?
Here's the problem with that. The problem with that is, number one, is that if you take away these attributes of critical theory, what you have is no longer critical theory, because these are the essential elements of critical theory that make it what it is. The other thing what happens, the other problem with this is that if you take away all the negative and toxic attributes of critical theory, then you're not going to have anything left over, because all the defining characteristics of critical theory are incompatible with Christianity. So if you remove them, then you got nothing. There's nothing left.
Okay. Well, all right, that makes sense. So you've given us 7 reasons to think that Christianity and critical theory are not logically compatible. You've given us 7 reasons to realize that Christians can't wield this weapon. We can't wield the ring of power. So with that in mind, I mean, in the past, I've said that Christianity and critical theory are not logically compatible because it's essential to the ideology of critical theory. And I made, you said, don't call it an ideology, it's a methodology. But I would say it was essential to the, and I would even call it a worldview back then, or to the ideology of critical theory, to view all people as either oppressed or as an oppressor. And it holds that each person's identity, as you mentioned, is fundamentally found in their group.
Critical theory doesn't hold those things. It's Marxism that holds those things.
Okay. So that's where I was confused. And I think many people are still confused. We see the weapon that's being held by the Marxist. And maybe you could say, like we say, guns don't kill people, people kill people. But we look, just how the left often attacks the gun. Well, they should be attacking the bad guy that had the gun. And I was making their same mistake. I was looking at the weapon and saying the weapon is bad, the weapon is evil, and it is. But really, it's the Marxists holding the weapon that I need to be more concerned with, don't you think?
Because the Marxist has the worldview and the ideology.
Yes.
The weapon is simply the tool that the Marxist uses to bring about the results and the effect that they actually, the end goal, the end game that they actually want to accomplish. So when somebody walks into a convenience store to rob the convenience store, he's got a gun in his hand, all right?
Right.
In his mind, he says, I want to rob this convenience store. The gun isn't saying, I want to rob this convenience store. The guy in his mind is saying, I'm going to rob the convenience store, and this is the weapon that I'm going to use as force in order to accomplish my objective of robbing the convenience store. So the owner of the convenience store doesn't look at the gun and say, oh, you don't want to lead a life of crime. Don't do that. That's really a bad thing to do. And you might go to jail if you go, he doesn't say it to the gun.
Yeah.
So you don't address critical theory in terms of rational content. You address the Marxist in order to find out what the worldview is. If you can dismantle the worldview, then he will drop his weapon and no longer have any incentive to use it.
And again, so this is why apologetics is important, because we're showing what worldview is true and what aren't. And so I think one thing I learned from you is you described it as, you said, look, you start with the worldview. And when it comes to Marxism and critical theory, that worldview is atheism or naturalism. That's the foundation.
Yeah.
So if we can destroy that foundation, then we've destroyed Marxism and critical race theory. But you've got the worldview, and then you told me that on top of that is the ideology or the theory, and that's Marxism. So Marxism is based upon the worldview, and then on top of Marxism, you've got the methodology or the weapon of critical theory, critical race theory. Did I get that right?
I think so. This is the way that I kind of view worldviews and ideas, and this is kind of how I organize them. It's a little bit, it may be a little bit arbitrary, but it has been helpful, very helpful in trying to analyze the truth claims of the world and so on. Because I really, personally, I consider that I think there's only 4 worldviews.
Yeah. Because
people come to me and they say, Phil, there are so many religions of the world. How can I possibly be an expert like you? And I'm not an expert. I can't rattle off all the attributes of every single religion in the world. There's thousands of them. And they say, yeah, but I can't cope with all these religions. How do I decide between them, and how do I answer them if I'm a Christian? And my reply to them is, there may be thousands of religions out there, but there are only really 4 basic worldviews. And every religion out there that you can find is going to fall into one of those 4 categories. So if you can identify what worldview they belong to, then you can address the attributes and properties of that worldview. If you can actually refute the worldview and discredit it, then you've automatically addressed the issue of all the religions that are hanging off of it, right? Because I think that that a methodology inherits all the properties of the ideology on which it is based. And I think an ideology inherits all the properties and implications of the worldview on which it is based. So that means that if atheism is the worldview that forms the foundation and the bedrock of Marxism, then I think that Marxism is going to inherit all the properties and implications of atheism. So you're not going to find a doctrine in Marxism that says, we really should love God and love our neighbor.
Right.
It's not going to happen because the worldview of atheism is not going to produce that doctrine in an ideology that's based on it. Yeah. And so I see this inheritance, this cascading inheritance of ideas, all the way from the worldview to the ideology to the methodology. And that has helped me in a great deal in understanding these things and in confronting them. And it's a lot easier to understand 4 worldviews than it is to understand 1,000 religions. Right. And I think those 4 worldviews, the basic 4 worldviews, are atheism, agnosticism, pantheism, and theism. Now, those worldviews have subcategories underneath them, right. And implications. Under atheism, you have materialism, naturalism, physicalism, scientism, determinism. There's several broad implications of atheism, and some people call those worldviews as well. And if they want to call them worldviews, I'm not going to argue with them. That's fine. That's their preference. That's okay. But under agnosticism, you have soft agnosticism and hard agnosticism. And soft agnosticism says, I don't know. Hard agnosticism says, no one knows. And then under pantheism, you have pure pantheism, you have monism, you have panentheism, but all those are subcategories of pantheism. And some people call panentheism a worldview, and fine by me. I don't care. It's just that I found it very helpful to categorize things this way, and it's helped me to deal with various granular ideologies and ideas and methodologies when I can put them within the context of where they come from.
That makes total sense. Yeah, and even if somebody was going to push back and say, "Oh, I'm not sure. I think there might be another." I mean, it wouldn't be. You still got only a handful of worldviews, but I think you're right to.
I think those worldviews are exhaustive categories. I think there's only 4 because a worldview, in my view, is a description and a definition of the nature of ultimate reality.
Right.
That's what I think the function of a worldview is. And when it comes to ultimate reality, there's only 4 options.
Yeah.
Under theism, you have polytheism and deism and that monotheism, things like that, but they're still subcategories under theism, and I think that general broad category is one of the only four that are optional, that are out there.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've got a little less than 5 minutes left if we're going to hit the stay under the 2-hour mark. So let's wrap it up. And what resources would you recommend? Whether they be books or authors or other experts that we can learn about, or at least learn more about the dangers of critical theory and critical race theory and Marxism in general.
Well, there aren't a lot of people out there that are really doing this in a very comprehensive way, but there are some people who are taking slices of this ideology and methodology, and they're confronting it. And I think they're doing a good job. I think Monique Duson is doing a fantastic job addressing critical race theory. And by the way, critical race theory is really critical theory, but it is simply framing a specific area of social science in critical theory that has to do with racism.
Yeah.
So critical race theory is when the message would be all white people are racist, all minorities are being oppressed, all black people are being oppressed, and so on. So I think Monique has done a wonderful job. She is so articulate, and she's such a delight to listen to because she's such a sharp mind. So I think she's a good resource.
She's a student, a master's degree student, I think in the MDiv program right now. I think maybe a philosophy. I can't remember for sure, but she's at Biola. It shows. So she is a force to be reckoned with on that campus. She's fighting evil as it's trying to infiltrate. She's on the front lines there, and she started an organization that she hopes will replace Black Lives Matter, the organization called the Center for Biblical Unity. Right. So I encourage people to take a look that up, support her financially, and pray for that organization.
Vadi Baucham is another one. He's done extensive study in cultural Marxism. He's very, very articulate with cultural Marxism. Mm-hmm. And he also is doing some of the same work in comparing cultural Marxism with the Christian worldview. And I'm not sure where he stands on critical theory, how he treats critical theory. But he has studied the ideas coming out of the Frankfurt School. So he's going to know all these guys that I mentioned, Max Horkheimer and Herbert Marcuse. He knows a lot of this stuff. Has some great thoughts and great insights into that.
Look up on YouTube. Is it Vodi Baucham or Baucham? Do you know?
I don't remember how to pronounce it, and I think it's pronounced Baucham, but I'm not quite sure about that.
I think it's Baucham, but I could be wrong about that. But look him up on YouTube. Watch his videos. His first name is Voddie, I believe.
Yeah, and it's Baucham. Yeah. Awesome. Vadi is just absolutely sharp. Mm-hmm. Razor sharp.
Who else do you got?
Well, you mentioned Neil Shenvi.
Yes.
Neil Shenvi has done great work in lots of different areas of apologetics, so he's a good resource. And then Moses Apostaticus is a good resource. Mm-hmm. Oh, did you want to say something about Neil real quick?
I was just going to say about Neil, he's his colleague is named Pat Sawyer. So okay. They've kind of started a team. They're kind of a dynamic duo. And so look up Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer's work. They actually wrote an article for Free Thinking Ministries a couple of years ago, and it was the leading or the most clicked on article of the website on the entire website that year. So they know what they're talking about. Check them out. But talk about Moses
Apostaticus. Yes. Yeah, he has a doctorate. But his writings are a little bit different. He confronts globalism through kind of the conduit of cultural Marxism, and he doesn't have any footnotes in his books.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he pretty much says this is not an academic work. So if you're looking for footnotes, you're not going to find them. He says, I'm going to give you my insights, and you can either take them or leave them. Okay.
Well,
and I don't agree with every insight that he has come up with, but he does have some solid understanding of cultural Marxism. He understands the culture wars very well right now.
I want to add two people here to your list. One is Elisa Childers. She's not laser focused on critical theory, but she's laser focused on progressive Christianity.
Right.
Progressive Christianity really is open to critical theory, and a lot of times you'll see them merge into one.
Right.
She's got a
I actually read an article called "The Poisons of Progressivism," and I'm convinced that now progressivism, more than any other time in history, has almost merged with Marxism, and they're almost interchangeable.
Well, and I'll tell you what, as I was having my that debate a couple weeks ago with a few of those Christian scholars who were quite friendly with the idea of critical theory, the guy on the thread that was fighting for it the most and defending it the most was a progressive Christian who denies the authority of Scripture, denies the existence of the soul, denies or I should say rejects Paul's writings, just rejects Adam and Eve. I mean, just rejects so much about Christianity. It's like, how can you still call this Christianity?
And there's something that we have to really, really emphasize here, and that is that Marxism, cultural Marxism, neo-Marxism has invaded our culture. But the other extremely important point we have to make is that it has invaded the body of Christ like a cancer.
That's right.
And like a cancer. And there are people who are replacing the gospel of personal redemption with the gospel of social justice, because social justice is all about class conflict and about the overthrow of the minority classes against, or the overthrow of the majority classes against the minority classes. That's what social justice is. It is pure Marxism. And there are so many churches who are now preaching the gospel of social justice, and sometimes some you don't even realize that they have just simply taken the bait that critical theory has given them, because it sounds so much like the gospel. It sounds so compassionate, that it can easily infiltrate the body of Christ, and it has done so to an enormous extent.
That's right. Well, there's one other person I've got to put on this list, and you might not do it, so let me do it. I would put you on the list, Phil. People need to be aware of your work. That primarily right now is on freethinkingministries.com. I've asked you to continue to send me articles. Do you have anywhere else that people could find stuff from you?
I've written some articles on a website called Caffeinated Thoughts. And that's an organization in Iowa, because I grew up in Iowa.
Okay.
So that's my friend Shane Vanderhart. I've published a lot of articles on Caffeinated Thoughts, but I haven't published very many recently. Most of the articles that I've written recently have all been published on Free Thinking Ministries. But I have articles on all sorts of other topics in Caffeinated Thoughts. I've got articles on abortion. I have articles on, our social political climate, and how did we end up, electing the orange-haired buffoon to the White House, and stuff like that. What the alternative was, and how Marxism has actually crept into the political sphere as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because there is an enormous amount of Marxist influence in the political sphere right now in this country. That's a good place, and it's just all spelled out, caffeinatedthoughts.com. But I have really pretty much focused on Free Thinking Ministries recently and haven't really published anywhere else. My own website is philbear.org, but it's really primitive right now, and I'm starting to put some of these articles on there, but I think I only have 2 right now.
Well, we'll make sure that people are staying tuned and are familiar with your work, whether it be on our website, other websites, or, and I'd love to have you on the show again in the future, in the near future.
I won't argue that.
All right, good. Well, we did go 5 minutes over time, but who's counting? This was a great conversation. Thank you so much for being here, Phil.
Yep.
And any closing thoughts?
I think somebody had alluded to what our strategy should be to try to address the insurgence of critical theory and Marxism and so on. And I think what I would call on all Christians to do is to not only reject critical theory as a valid methodology to be used in Christian discipleship, but also to educate yourself on it. And to talk about it, because one of the things that is happening in our society right now is that we are being silenced, and we should not tolerate being silenced. We need to make sure that we speak up, even if it's uncomfortable. We need to be able to have these conversations. We need to have the conversations in our churches, in our schools, in our political caucuses. We have to flood our society with insights and information into how this is happening and what is happening.
And that is the Christian thing to do. Jesus was not silent. His disciples were not silent. The apostle Paul was not silent. Led to their deaths, right? But we are called to not be quiet. We are called to speak the truth no matter what. And I just want to close with this from Shiami. I hope I pronounced that right. Shiami says, "Thank you, gentlemen, for presenting a very eye-opening discussion. God bless you both." Well, God bless you, Shiami, and everybody else who's been following along and watching our conversation. Phil, I promise to have you back on soon. All right, brother?
It's a deal.
All right, man.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, everybody else, thanks for hanging with us. I know this was a long conversation, but stay tuned. Subscribe to our YouTube channel here and keep going to freethinkingministries.com to see the different articles that we have. Some people like to watch videos. Other people like to read blog articles. We try to give you everything so that everybody's happy. So anyway, thanks for hanging with us, and we will talk to you soon. In the meantime, stay reasonable.